Run away from the stalker. It was one of those summer nights where the air was still, and everything seemed eerily quiet. The large, suburban house, with its perfectly trimmed lawn, stood imposingly. Inside, Chase and I had no idea of the terror about to unfold. I was 15 at the time, hanging out at my friend Chase's house. His parents were out, and we were home alone. The basement was every kid's dream. A TV, a pool table, video games. It was the kind of place that made you forget the world outside, and we were living the dream. We lounged on a big leather couch, watching a horror movie on TV, munching on chips. Chase had started to doze off. I was struggling with my own unease, the kind of anxiety I often felt when sleeping over at a friend's house. But tonight, it felt different. It was much worse. It must have been past midnight when I heard it. A door creaking open slowly. I glanced over the back of the couch and saw something unsettling. The laundry room door in the basement was wide open. I wanted to believe it was a trick of my mind, maybe just the wind, but I knew better. I quickly shook Chase awake. Chase, wake up. The laundry room door. It opened by itself. Chase, groggy and half asleep, mumbled something about it happening all the time and told me to go back to sleep. He didn't seem panicked, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling crawling down my spine. I insisted that we go close it together. We both got up and cautiously shut the door. Chase flopped back onto the couch, falling asleep within minutes. I tried to relax, but sleep didn't come easily. A while later, I woke up again, but this time, it wasn't a sound that startled me. Standing behind the couch, looking down at us, was a man. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The man was pale, sickly looking, with sunken eyes and an expression that was deeply unsettling. He stood there, motionless, just staring at us. I screamed, a sound that shattered the stillness of the night. Chase jolted awake, his eyes wide with horror as he saw the man advancing toward us. In our panic, we ran. The basement had two exits, one leading upstairs to the front door, the other to a sliding door at the patio. In our terror, we split up. I ran for the patio while Chase bolted up the stairs. Gasping for breath, I quickly called the police, shouting out the address and frantically explaining that someone had broken into the house. But Chase, I couldn't leave him behind. I circled the house, sneaking back in through the same door I had used to escape. My heart pounded as I stepped inside. It was too quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. I knew I had to find Chase. I moved as quietly as I could, climbing the stairs, each step creaking beneath me. The house was massive, and the silence was suffocating. Then I heard it, Chase's voice. His scream, a desperate, terrified scream for help. I bolted up the stairs, my legs trembling. At the top of the stairs, I saw the man, the intruder, wrapping his hands around Chase's neck, choking him, his face twisted in a grotesque expression. Chase's eyes were wide, his face flushed as he struggled to breathe. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy sports trophy from Chase's room. Without thinking, I charged at the man. I swung the trophy with all my strength, smashing it into the back of the intruder's head. The man collapsed to the floor, and Chase fell with him, gasping for air, but alive. We didn't wait. We ran outside, not stopping until we reached Chase's treehouse. There, we hid, waiting for the sound of sirens. Chase was still trembling, rubbing his neck where the man's hands had gripped him just minutes earlier. We sat in silence, too afraid to speak. I looked out through the small window in the treehouse, scanning the yard for any sign of movement. The house looked eerily still, as if nothing had ever happened. Chase whispered, "What do we do now?" I had no answer. All I knew was that I couldn't let him go back inside. Suddenly, a faint rustling came from the direction of the house. I held my breath, straining to listen. At first, it was soft, like footsteps on grass. Then, I saw him, the man. He was slowly walking across the yard, his movements deliberate. His sunken eyes stared straight ahead, almost robotic, as he made his way toward the treehouse. I grabbed Chase's arm, pulling him away from the window. He's coming. We both backed into the corner of the tiny treehouse, barely breathing. The man's footsteps grew louder. Now I could hear him, crunching on the gravel path leading to the treehouse ladder. The creaking of the ladder made me jump with fear. He was climbing. I could feel the weight of him pressing down on the structure as the treehouse swayed with each step. Chase looked at me, eyes wide with terror. I had to do something. I scanned the cramped space, frantically searching for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a rusty toolbox Chase's dad had left there months ago. I grabbed a metal rod nearby, gripping it tightly in my trembling hands. The man's hand appeared at the edge of the treehouse entrance, his fingers curling around the wooden frame. I swung the rod down with all my strength. The man let out a groan of pain, lost his balance, and fell backward off the ladder. He hit the ground hard. I grabbed Chase, and we scrambled down, running as fast as we could toward the house. My mind raced. Where could we go? The man had fallen, but he wasn't dead, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he got up again. Panting, I pulled Chase toward the side of the house, where thick bushes and overgrown trees hid us from view. We crouched down, trying to catch our breath. Suddenly, headlights appeared in the distance, the sound of tires crunching on gravel. It was the police. I whispered to Chase to wave for help. We stood cautiously, peering around the bushes. The man was nowhere to be seen. I signaled to Chase to follow me. We darted toward the driveway as the police car came to a stop. Relief washed over me as two officers stepped out, immediately scanning the area. I shouted, "He's still here!" "He's..." Before I could finish, a man emerged from the shadows, appearing from the side of the house. His movements were slower, more deliberate. Blood dripped from a gash on his head. The officers drew their weapons, ordering him to stop. But he didn't listen. He kept walking toward us, his eyes locked on Chase and me. The man ignored them, continuing his slow, deliberate walk. And then, without warning, he charged at us in a terrifying sprint. A gunshot from the police tore through the night. The man staggered, collapsing to the ground, gasping for breath. A wave of numbness washed over me. It was finally over. That night, as Chase and I sat in the police station, I learned that the man was a drifter, living in abandoned houses across the city. He was mentally unstable, with a history of violent behavior. But the most chilling detail? In his pocket, they found a crumpled old photograph. It was of Chase's house. The man had been watching us for a long time. Chase and I stood outside the police station, waiting for our parents to arrive. The terror of the night still weighed heavily on us. It served as a reminder that real horror doesn't always come from the darkness. Sometimes it's standing right behind you, watching. Intruder from the garage. It was just another long, dull day at school. But as I walked home, the excitement of Friday relieved me. Tomorrow was a day off from school. Finally, I could relax. As I approached home, I noticed something strange. The garage door was wide open, and the light inside was still on. My dad had left early that day for a business trip, so he must have rushed and forgotten to close it. I didn't think much of it at the time. I went into the garage, turned off the light, and pulled the door shut behind me. The silence of the house welcomed me as I stepped inside, and the thought of having the whole place to myself felt like freedom. My mom had gone to a friend's house for the evening, so I settled in for a night of video games and movies. Hours passed as I immersed myself in my game. The house was quiet except for the occasional noise from the TV. I decided to get a drink, and as I walked into the kitchen, something caught my attention. The light in the garage was on again. I paused. A strange, eerie feeling washed over me. Had I forgotten to turn it off? Or had my mom come home? But I hadn't heard her come in. My heart began to race as I approached the garage door, my footsteps feeling heavy. As I stepped into the garage, every drawer in my dad's workshop was open. His tools were scattered across the floor as if someone had frantically searched for something, but there was no one here. I quickly turned back inside, locking the garage door. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I prepared to head back to the living room, planning to try to watch TV to calm down. Then, from behind me, I heard the garage door handle rattle violently. I froze, staring at the door, watching it shake harder, as if someone on the other side was desperately trying to get in. I grabbed my phone, my hand trembling as I realized I needed to get out of the house. In my panic, I didn't notice that the noise had suddenly stopped. The silence was chilling. It was too quiet. I ran straight for the front door. My only thought was to escape. But as I stepped into the living room, I froze in my tracks. He was there, a large man, his back turned to me. In his hand, he gripped a hatchet, likely taken from my dad's workshop. I held my breath, terrified he would turn around and see me. The TV was still playing, masking the sound of my footsteps, and I knew this was my only chance. Going back upstairs was impossible. I quietly turned around and headed for the back door, trying to remain calm. Once outside, I didn't stop running. I hurried to my neighbor's house, knocking on the door until they let me in. I waited there, heart pounding, watching my house from across the street as I prayed the intruder wouldn't come looking for me. I knocked on my neighbor's door, my heart racing, breath coming in gasps. It felt like an eternity before Mr. Thompson finally opened the door, his face etched with confusion. I recounted everything that had happened to him. His eyes widened, and without saying a word, he grabbed a flashlight and his old baseball bat. He was determined to check my house for me, assuring me that everything would be okay. I reluctantly stayed behind, watching him cross the street. My body still trembled with fear, my mind racing with worst-case scenarios. I had called the police. They were on their way, but the thought of that man in my house, with my dad's hatchet in hand, haunted me. I watched as Mr. Thompson cautiously approached the front door, using the flashlight to scan the windows and garage. He disappeared inside. I strained to listen for anything, but everything was eerily silent. Suddenly, I saw him step outside, and from across the street, a small voice echoed back, "There's no one there. The house is empty." A wave of relief washed over me, but I still needed to remain vigilant. As Mr. Thompson started to walk toward me, I felt that lingering anxiety return. Before I could voice my concerns, a dark figure shifted behind him. My blood ran cold. The intruder. He was there, emerging from the shadows of the house, with an axe glinting under the dim porch light. I screamed, trying to warn Mr. Thompson, but it was too late. As he turned around, the intruder lunged at him. A fierce struggle ensued. Mr. Thompson swung the baseball bat, but the intruder was strong. The two grappled, the axe dangerously close to Mr. Thompson's head as they stumbled across the lawn. My legs wouldn't move, paralyzed with fear as I watched the scene unfold. Every second felt like a nightmare. Mr. Thompson tried to deliver a solid blow with the bat, striking the man's ribs, but it wasn't enough. The intruder howled in pain, but instead of backing off, he raised the axe, ready to attack. Just as the axe came down, Mr. Thompson lunged to the side, narrowly avoiding the strike. In that moment of distraction, Mr. Thompson landed another blow, throwing the intruder off balance. I finally decided to rush forward to help, but before I could reach them, the sound of police sirens rang out. The intruder looked up at the sound of the sirens, and in a final effort to escape, he sprinted toward the backyard. Mr. Thompson staggered to his feet, breathing heavily but still standing strong. The police arrived just in time, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they chased after the man. Within minutes, they had subdued him. The man thrashed wildly, growling like a wild beast, but the police quickly overpowered him, pinning him to the ground and cuffing his hands behind his back. I stood there, trembling, watching the whole scene unfold. Mr. Thompson walked over to me, holding his side where he had been hit, but he still managed to smile. "You're safe now." I felt grateful, as if I had been saved. I recounted every detail I could remember to the police, but all I wanted to do was forget. I sat down on Mr. Thompson's porch, my body shaking, watching the man being driven away in the police car. It was all over, but the image of the intruder's face, his wild eyes, and the sound of the axe slicing through the air would haunt me forever. Mr. Thompson sat next to me, placing his hand on my shoulder for reassurance. "You did the right thing, kid," he said softly. "It's over now." But deep down, I knew the fear would linger with me. I would never forget how close I had come to being trapped in the grip of something truly evil. Nightmare Neighbor. The old, tall apartment building stood under the dim glow of the streetlights. It was late, and most of the windows were dark. Rena stood outside the building, staring up at the second floor where her apartment was. She had lived here for a few months, and the place had always been quiet. Until Arthur moved in next door. Rena's apartment was at the end of the hallway on the second floor, and the trip to take out the trash usually took only a few minutes. But tonight, she felt eyes on her. As she was about to turn the corner at the end of the hall, there he was. Arthur was standing by his door, as if waiting for her. He always found a reason to talk and stand too close to her. She kept her head down, mumbled a quick greeting, and brushed past him toward the stairs. This time, he said nothing. A chill ran down Rena's spine. Something was different tonight, something that made her more uneasy than before. Rena stepped into her apartment and quickly shut the door. She took a moment to calm herself, telling herself she was overreacting. She turned off the lights in the living room, planning to head to bed and watch some TV. It was late, and she was tired but not quite ready to sleep. As she passed the broom closet, she heard something, a faint sound, like a rustling from inside. Her heart skipped a beat, and she froze, staring at the closet door. With trembling hands, she reached for the closet handle. She hesitated. Every instinct screamed at her not to open it, but she had to. She couldn't just leave it. She pulled the door open. Arthur was standing there, in her closet. For a split second, time seemed to stop. He was just standing there, staring at her, unblinking, with a twisted smile on his face. She gasped, stumbling backward. Her heart raced as panic rose inside her. He stepped forward, crawling out of the closet like a predator closing in on its prey. She ran into the bedroom, slamming the door shut, but she didn't have time to lock it. The door flew open, and Arthur was right there, his face wild. She dashed for the bathroom, her final place of refuge. She slammed the door just as Arthur reached the bedroom. Her hands fumbled with the lock. Rena pressed her back against the cold bathroom wall. Her breath came in sharp gasps as Arthur pounded on the door, trying to break through. The thin wooden door was all that separated her from the man who had been stalking her for weeks, his sick grin etched into her mind. Thankfully, she had brought her phone with her. She gripped it tightly, her fingers trembling as she spoke to the police. Her voice was barely a whisper, fear choking her words. Arthur slammed the door again, the wood splintering under the force. Rena knew it wouldn't hold much longer. Suddenly, the pounding stopped. She held her breath, pressing her ear to the door, straining to hear any sound. Was he gone? Had he given up? Arthur stood outside the bathroom door, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with anticipation. His patience was wearing thin. His hand hovered over the doorknob before he stepped back. Glancing at Rena's bedroom, he knew she was cornered, with nowhere to go. Slowly, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, shiny knife. His fingers tightened around the handle, and his eyes narrowed. With a single powerful kick, the bathroom door splintered apart. The door burst open, and Arthur lunged inside, his eyes wide and feral. She backed up until she was almost against the wall. She screamed for him to stay away, but Arthur didn't stop. He lunged at her, grabbing her arm in a grip so tight it would leave bruises. Rena tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Pain shot down her spine as he twisted her wrist, pinning it to the wall. The phone slipped from her hand, crashing to the floor. Arthur's face was now only a few centimeters from hers, whispering threats because she always ignored him in the hallway. Rena struggled, trying to break free, but he pulled her closer, tightening his grip. His knife slashed through the air, grazing her arm. She gasped as a sharp pain cut through her skin, blood trickling down. The sound of sirens tore through the night, growing louder as the police raced toward the apartment building. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, like a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. Inside, Rena's vision blurred with panic and pain. He shoved her against the wall again, laughing maniacally as he brought the knife closer to her throat. Her body screamed for escape. Her free hand groped blindly along the counter near the sink, desperately searching for anything she could use to defend herself. She grabbed a glass soap bottle and, without thinking, smashed it over Arthur's head. The glass shattered, and he staggered back, momentarily dazed. Arthur staggered. The knife slipped from his hand and fell to the floor. Rena did not wait. She rushed out the door, holding her throbbing arm that was bleeding from the cut he made. She ran out of the bathroom and into the living room, her mind screaming for escape. But Arthur wasn't far behind. Stunned, but enraged, he grabbed the knife again and charged toward her, blood streaming down his face from where the glass had struck him. The police burst through the front door of the apartment complex, racing up the stairs to the second floor. They knew they had to act quickly. Rena reached the living room, but her legs buckled beneath her, sending her crashing to the floor. She could feel Arthur's looming presence, approaching with the knife in hand. His eyes were now filled with rage, the twisted delight gone. He reached for her, grabbing her hair. Rena winced in pain, trying to get up, her body screaming for help. Arthur growled, his voice low and venomous. "There's nowhere left to run, girl." Just as he raised the knife again, the apartment door burst open with a loud crash. The police swarmed into the apartment, guns drawn. "Drop the weapon," one of them shouted, their voices slicing through the tension. Arthur hesitated, giving Rena the opening she needed. She kicked his leg hard, causing him to cry out in pain. She ran toward the police, gasping for breath, blood dripping from her arm. But the nightmare was finally over. Rena sat on the edge of the ambulance, her mind still reeling, her body in shock. She watched as the police loaded Arthur into the back of their car. The flashing lights of the police car faded into the night as they drove away. Haunting on the midnight train, the town lay deep in the mountains, with old houses scattered about and streets filled with whispers of long-forgotten stories. One of those mysterious tales was about the midnight train. For many years, no one dared to board the train, but I was not like them. I was the kind of person who believed that fear was for those not seeking answers. On that cold winter night, I decided it was time to confront the truth myself. I arrived at the train station just before midnight. The platform was empty, the old wooden benches creaking under the weight of the cold wind. Flickering lights cast strange shadows. The ticket counter was manned by an elderly station master, his eyes glancing at me with a mix of concern and pity.
"Are you sure about this, son?"
I nodded, smiling confidently at him. "It's just a train ride. I'll be back." The station master sighed and handed me the ticket. I caught a glimpse of him muttering a small prayer as I walked toward the platform. The slow minutes dragged on as I waited. The air felt heavier than usual, as if the town was holding its breath. Then, in the distance, I heard the whistle of a train, its headlights slicing through the darkness like two eerie eyes. The train stopped before me, its peeling black paint and dirty, soulless windows. The door creaked open, inviting me inside. I hesitated for a moment, but then took a deep breath and stepped inside. The flickering lights cast long shadows across the old seats. The air was thick with dust and something else, something I couldn't quite identify. A feeling, unnatural. As I walked down the aisle, I realized the train was empty. No passengers, no ticket collector, no signs of life. Strangely, I wasn't scared. Instead, I felt a thrill. I sat by the window, watching the small town fade away into the distance. At first, everything seemed fine. The train accelerated, speeding through the night, but after what felt like hours, I noticed something was off. The darkness outside the window was unusual, like a void. I glanced at the clock, only to see the hands frozen in place. A sense of unease washed over me. The light above me flickered violently before plunging the train into complete darkness. I held my breath. I fumbled for my phone, hoping to use it as a flashlight. But when I pressed the screen, it remained black, completely unresponsive. Panic set in. Suddenly, I heard it, a whisper.
"Jacob."
My heart skipped a beat. I froze, trying to listen. The voice was faint, barely above a breath, but it was there.
"Jacob, come to me."
I turned around, but the car was empty. The whispers grew louder, closer. I hurriedly stood up and stumbled, trying to find the ticket collector's car. When I reached the front, I found the car empty. Just an old, dusty uniform hanging on a hook. No one was there. The train shook violently, throwing me off balance. I clung to the seat to steady myself as the whole car seemed to tremble. The train was moving faster, dangerously fast. I reached for the control panel, hoping to stop the train, but it was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been used in years. My fingers fumbled over the switches, but nothing worked. Then the whispers returned, growing louder, filling the air around me.
"You can't escape, Jacob."
My blood ran cold. Those words seeped into my ears, chilling me to the bone. I turned to leave, but something held my feet in place. I looked down and saw an old pair of shoes still attached to a ghostly figure. It was pale, translucent, its face twisted in pain. Its hollow eyes stared at me. Then, more appeared. Ghostly figures emerged from the darkness, their bodies flickering like dying candles. They reached out to me, their cold, damp hands, their voices filled with sorrow.
"Help us. Save us."
I tried to back away, but the shadowy figures closed in on me. Their icy hands brushed against my skin, sending shivers down my spine. Desperate, I pushed them away, their cries echoing in my ears. I needed to escape now. At the back of the train, I found a locked door leading outside. I pounded on it, shouting, but it wouldn't budge. Then, in the corner of the car, I noticed a faint light. I knelt down and lifted a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an old, dust-covered journal. The journal belonged to the original train conductor. He described strange occurrences and ghosts. His final entry spoke of a curse, a train cursed to hold the souls of the dead on board. and there was only one way to break it: by confronting the source of the haunting and seeking out the mirror in the car to destroy it. Determined, I followed through to the back of the train. At the rear, I found a large, cracked mirror. Its surface shimmered with a strange energy. Looking into it, I saw the faces of trapped souls reflected in the glass, their eyes filled with sorrow. Its shape shifted and swirled. Terror engulfed me, but I couldn't let it win. I searched for something to break it, as if someone were hiding everything to stop me from doing this. I decided not to wait, reaching out with trembling hands, and punched the cold glass. The figure screamed a piercing scream as the mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces. The ghastly shadows around me began to fade, their faces peaceful as they were finally freed. The train also started to slow down. I staggered onto the platform, my heart still racing, my body aching from the ordeal. The town, now bathed in the gentle light of dawn, returned to its quiet state. As I looked back at the train, it was now just an old locomotive. The station master was waiting for me on the platform, a pleasant smile of relief understanding what I had accomplished as he left. I nodded, too exhausted to speak, but grateful to be alive. I had freed the trapped souls on the midnight train, and I knew I would never forget the terror I had faced. The midnight train had become legend, but the memory of that night would stay with me forever. Mysterious masked person. The house was peaceful under the moonlight, and it seemed like it would be a simple summer week without my parents. They trusted me to take care of everything, and so far, I had been enjoying video games, staying up late every kid's dream. Around 11 o'clock p.m., I was lounging on the couch, absorbed in my game. My phone buzzed beside me. A message from an unknown number popped up on the screen. Hi. I frowned. Who was this? I asked, but the reply came instantly, mixed with irritation and aggression. You don't know who this is? I tried explaining that I had just gotten a new phone and lost my contacts, but the angry messages kept coming. I assumed it was a prank and put my phone on silent, returning to my game. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but I was startled by a sound, a knock on the bedroom window. At first, I thought I was imagining it. It was late, and I'd been alone for days. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Still, I cautiously moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. Nothing, just an empty yard. But I knew I'd heard something. I pulled out my phone, intending to call my mom, when I noticed several unread messages from the same unknown number. The last one sent chills down my spine. I'm here. I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. I immediately tried to call my mom, but the screen flashed, no signal. No way. We always had good reception here. I ran to the back porch and listened. Maybe, just maybe, someone was crying for help. I had years of self-defense training, and despite the fear surging through me, I was ready to defend myself. This could be a setup, a trick. I grabbed an old baseball bat from the garage and stepped into the backyard. The night was eerily quiet, which made me even more uneasy. I walked toward the edge of the trees, sweeping through the shadows. I shouted into the night, trying to sound confident, demanding who was there and telling them not to mess with me. Suddenly, a flashlight flickered, shining straight at me from deep in the woods. Whoever was holding it was too far for me to see their face, but they were trying to get my attention. The light went out as quickly as it had come on, and the screaming started again, this time more desperate. I slowly made my way toward the spot where the light had appeared. As I got closer to the trees, my heart pounded louder than my footsteps. The woods were dense, with towering trees casting deep shadows. I knew I shouldn't be doing this, but I couldn't stop. I yelled out, asking where the person was. A voice answered from somewhere ahead, a faint whisper saying,
Here, Help me.
I stepped deeper into the woods. My grip tightened around the bat, and my legs felt heavy as I moved forward. I saw a figure. My voice trembled as I asked if it was the person calling for help. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it started moving. In a split second, I realized this wasn't someone tied up. This was someone alive, and they were running toward me. Panic surged through me, and something inside screamed at me to get away to save my life. I didn't know how, but I ran. I slammed the porch door behind me, locking it, then sprinted to my room, slamming the door shut. The knocking started again, first at the front door, then at the window. It was relentless, as if he was trying to break in from every corner. He wasn't playing anymore. He was hunting me. I heard the sound of glass shattering from the living room. My heart raced as I realized he was inside. Footsteps echoed through the house, slow and deliberate. He was looking for me. I hid behind the bedroom door, gripping the bat. I held on so tightly my knuckles turned white. The footsteps grew closer. I could hear his breathing just outside my door. The door creaked open, and I saw the wolf mask peeking out. He cautiously stepped inside, unaware that I was right behind him. In that split second, I swung the bat as hard as I could. It slammed into his head. He collapsed to the ground, and I didn't stop. I swung over and over until I was sure he wouldn't get up. The house was now quiet after the chaos. Inside, everything was still. The intruder in the wolf mask lay motionless on the floor, while I stood over him, panting, hands shaking as I gripped the bloodied bat. I stared down at the man, his body sprawled across the floor. The wolf mask, now cracked, still covered his head, hiding his face. For a moment, I froze, unable to process what I had just done. My phone still had no signal, but I needed help. I needed to get out of there. I rushed to the landline in the kitchen, my hands trembling uncontrollably as I dialed 911. I struggled to find the words, pressing the phone tightly to my ear, trying to calm down. I glanced back at the hallway leading to my bedroom, terrified that the masked man would get up again. The distant sound of sirens broke the silence of the night. Red and blue lights flickered across the walls as the police car stopped in front of the house. Their grim faces approached the door as I shakily opened it. The officers stepped inside, examining the broken glass, the signs of a struggle, and finally, the man lying on the floor. One officer knelt down, checking for a pulse. He said, "You did the right thing," as if he had seen this horror many times before. They told me to sit down and breathe, but I couldn't focus on anything except that mask. The wolf mask. Why? Why did he choose to wear it? The unconscious man was lifted onto a stretcher. His mask still hadn't been removed. My mind was still reeling from the events that had just unfolded. The next morning, I was at the police station. The officers asked me about the man, whether I had ever seen him before. I shook my head, explaining the messages, the strange knocks, and the wolf mask. Then, they told me his name was Thomas, and he had been on the run for years. A detective handed me a file filled with old newspaper clippings and photographs. The story they told me was chilling. Thomas had a disturbing past. Years ago, he had committed a series of home invasions in nearby towns. He would stalk his victims for days, learning their routines before making his move. And he always wore a mask to cover half his face. But it wasn't just any mask. The wolf mask had become his signature. In every report, survivors described the same thing. A tall man in a wolf mask, terrorizing families, always escaping before the police could catch him, until now. The final piece of the mystery was revealed when the detective, now more familiar with Thomas's case, explained why he chose the wolf mask. The detective slid a newspaper article toward me. It had a blurry photo of the wolf mask next to a headline that read, "Wolf Stalker Evades Capture." The detective said the wolf represented a predator, a cunning hunter. Thomas saw himself as the wolf, and his victims were the prey. It terrified me to think about how long he might have been watching me, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. He had been toying with me, like a wolf plays with its prey. That night, back home, I sat alone in the living room, the faint hum of the TV filling the silence. My parents wouldn't be leaving me alone for a long time after this. The mystery of why he wore the mask had been solved, but the fear of that night still lingered. I didn't know if I would ever feel truly safe again, but one thing I did know, I would never forget the image of that cracked wolf mask lying on the floor. Stalked by the clown at the chicken shop. I was working full-time at a chicken shop. Not exactly the job I wanted, but it was enough to get by. Most evenings, I survived on leftover chicken, and then that Saturday night happened. It had been a long and exhausting day. The restaurant was packed from morning until late at night. As I was cleaning up, my feet aching, I noticed him sitting alone at a table in the corner, waving frantically. At first, I thought he wanted to order, so I walked over, trying to smile. But as I got closer, I realized he wasn't a normal customer. He was a mime, grinning widely, dressed in the classic black and white striped outfit, his face painted ghostly white. He didn't say a word. He just performed. I guessed he wanted chicken and fries, so I handed him the food without thinking much about it. I was too tired to care. His expression twisted with irritation the moment I gave him the tray. His grin morphed into a frown. He suddenly stood up and threw a few fake punches into the air like a boxer. Exhaustion overwhelmed me. I told him to leave, but his face darkened even more. Slowly, he raised his hand, mimicking the act of pulling something invisible from his back. He stared at me without blinking, slashing the air with the invisible object. I played along, pretending to throw an imaginary stone at him. He staggered back, clutching his head as if I had struck him, then dashed out the door. I laughed at the absurdity of it. I thought it was harmless, but I was wrong. That night, my colleague and I were walking home together. I told him about the mime, and we laughed as we walked. But as we approached the building, I saw something, or rather, someone standing in the shadows of the hallway. A figure, dressed like the mime. I froze, staring, but chalked it up to my tired imagination. A few days later, after another late shift, I stepped outside. I walked home alone, the cold wind biting into my skin. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto my bed, not even bothering to change out of my uniform. As soon as my head hit the pillow, the doorbell yanked me out of my restless sleep. Groggily, I dragged myself to the door and peered through the peephole. It was the colleague I usually walked home with. He wore his usual green beanie, but stood with his back to the door. I mumbled as I unlocked the door. "Did you forget something again?" But when I opened it, it wasn't him. It was the mime, his face painted ghostly white, grinning at me, his eyes gleaming with malice. He bowed and slipped past me without a word, heading straight for the bag of leftover chicken on my table. I stood there, frozen, as the mime rummaged through the bag. He pulled out a chicken leg, took huge bites, chewing slowly, savoring it like some twisted parody of a meal. Then his eyes lit up. He turned to me, mimicking the act of dipping fries in ketchup, grinning like a madman. I couldn't take it anymore. I rushed over, snatched the food from his hand, and yelled at him to leave. His expression darkened. He slowly reached behind his back, pulling out the invisible knife he had shown me earlier. Only this time, it wasn't imaginary. Luckily, I reacted just in time, and it only grazed my arm. leaving a small cut. I bolted out of the room, blood dripping down the hallway. I could hear his footsteps behind me, faster, closer. In my panic, I fumbled with the buttons, desperately pressing the close button as he charged toward me. At the last second, the elevator doors closed. I collapsed to the floor, shaking, my vision blurred from pain and fear. The elevator doors finally opened in the lobby, and I staggered out, barely able to stand. My voice trembled as I called for help, and a passerby rushed over, eyes wide with fear. Someone had called 911. When the police arrived, after an hour of investigation, they told me they had searched the building but found no one matching my description, and the security footage had disappeared. He held up an evidence bag. Inside was the knife, but there were no fingerprints. They couldn't find him, but the weapon was proof that it had happened. After that, I moved away and quit my job. I couldn't step foot in that store again. But even now, I wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, hands shaking, and every time I see him in the corner of the room, grinning, holding that bag of chicken. Weird night at school. I work the night shift as a janitor at a local school. This job is ideal for anyone who enjoys solitude. It's just me, the empty school, and my mop bucket. I only talk to my coworker when it's absolutely necessary. Most of the time, we split the school and don't see each other during the entire shift. One night, the whole school was completely silent. The only sound was the occasional echo of my mop hitting the floor. I've done this thousands of times, but something about this night felt different, like something was watching me from the darkness. I brushed it off and continued cleaning, walking through each hallway. I wore my headphones, playing music softly enough to still hear if someone was around, but everything seemed normal. I took a short break to change the water in my mop bucket. When I came back, I noticed something strange. The wet floor sign I had set up earlier was knocked over. I sighed and went to pick it up, but that's when I saw them small, wet footprints leading away from the sign and down the hallway. I followed the footprints down the hallway, leading to the stairs up to the second floor. The footprints stopped at the top of the stairs. I paused, trying to hear anything. Then, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. It was fast, a flash of movement at the end of the hall. My pulse quickened, and I hurried to the end of the hall, but no one was there. Just then, I heard faint laughter, like the giggle of a child. It echoed through the empty school, sending chills down my spine. I turned around, looking for the source of the laughter, but saw no one. A loud crash suddenly broke the silence. The sound came from the first floor. My mop bucket, which I had just filled with clean water, was tipped over, spilling water all over the floor. My blood boiled with frustration. Someone was messing with me, and I wasn't in the mood for games. I grabbed a dry mop and started cleaning up. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My mind raced, trying to figure out what was going on. Were there still students in the building, or had someone snuck in after hours? I decided to talk to my coworker. Maybe she had seen something too. She laughed and told me I was messing with her. She looked at me, completely confused, shaking her head. I've been here the whole time. I couldn't make sense of it. I left her station, more confused than ever, and went back to work. Another hour passed. I was trying to make up for lost time when, without warning, the entire school went dark. For a moment, I was surrounded by darkness. Then the emergency lights flickered on, bathing everything in a dim red glow. It was unsettling, like the entire building had turned into the set of a horror movie. I knew where the electrical room was, and since I had the keys, I decided to head there to fix the lights. But before I could get there, I heard a scream. My coworker's scream, filled with fear. echoed through the school. I ran toward the electrical room, fear rising inside me. When I reached the door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest. When I pushed the door open, expecting to see my coworker inside, instead, there was a figure standing in the darkness. I couldn't make out who it was, but something was wrong. My blood ran cold as the figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, almost jerky. I reached for my phone, but before I could pull it out of my pocket, the figure lunged forward and slammed the door in my face. Panic overwhelmed me. I staggered back. I had to get out of there. I ran, my legs moving faster than ever. I needed to find my coworker. When I reached her area, her mop bucket was lying in the middle of the hallway, but she was gone, no sign of her. I called out her name, but there was no reply. The only sound was that faint laughter again, echoing through the empty hallway. The whispering froze me in place, my heart pounding in my chest. I quickly turned around, gripping the mop handle tightly, ready to defend myself. I started walking again, my steps slow and cautious, my senses on high alert. This wasn't just a prank. Something was happening here, something I couldn't explain. I went up to the second floor, where I had heard the laughter earlier. As I ventured further down the second floor hallway, I noticed something strange. The wet footprints, the same ones I had seen earlier, were back. I froze, staring at the small, wet prints that seemed to be coming toward me. I ducked into the nearest classroom, slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, trying to catch my breath, my hands trembling. The silence was suffocating, pressing in on me from all sides. That's when I saw the blackboard. Written in large, jagged letters were the words, "Hello." I hadn't seen that before. Someone had been in here, but I hadn't heard anyone enter. Suddenly, I heard the door rattling. Something was trying to get in. The doorknob twisted hard, and the door shook as if someone or something was pounding on it. I backed away, gripping the mop handle like a lifeline. The banging stopped. Silence returned, but the tension in the air remained. I slowly crept toward the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. I reached for the doorknob, turning it as gently as I could. I cracked the door open just a little and peeked out into the hallway. I cautiously stepped out, looking around for any sign of movement. I had to find my coworker. I couldn't stay in this school alone any longer. I started walking down, and just then, from where I stood, I saw a shadow at the bottom of the stairs. It didn't move, just stood there, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the red emergency lights. I squinted, trying to make out the shape. It was small, like a child. As I got closer, I could see more clearly a young boy, maybe 13 or 14, standing with his back to me, wearing a torn school uniform. I reached out, hesitating for a moment before speaking. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy didn't respond. I took another step, my hand trembling as I reached out to touch his shoulder. The boy's face was a grotesque mask, pale, soulless eyes, blood dripping from his nose, and a wide, twisted grin. My heart nearly stopped. The child let out a piercing scream that echoed through the staircase, a sound so shrill it felt like it was tearing through my skull. I stumbled back, dropping the mop. My legs felt weak, but I forced myself to run. I sprinted down the hallway, gasping for breath. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get out. The hallway seemed to stretch on endlessly in a horrific way. I burst through the double doors into the gymnasium, slamming them shut behind me. The gym was pitch black. I backed away from the door, my body shaking with fear. The footsteps stopped. The doors stayed closed. For a brief moment, I thought I was safe. But then, from the far corner of the gym, I heard a ball bouncing. There, in the far corner, The boy stood, his face still twisted in that grotesque grin, holding a basketball and slowly bouncing it on the floor. Then the boy whispered, "Hello," his voice echoing in the empty space of the gymnasium. I backed away, my legs trembling. The child took a step forward, then another. Each step was slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring the fear he was causing. I didn't think anymore. I bolted, running as fast as I could toward the parking lot. My legs felt like they could give out at any moment, but I kept running. I didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands shook as I fumbled with the keys, finally unlocking the door and jumping inside. As I started the engine, I looked back at the school. In one of the second-floor windows, I saw the child standing there, staring down at me with that twisted grin. I floored the gas and sped out of the parking lot. The image of that child burned into my mind. I didn't go back the next night. I never went back there again. Run away from strangers. The grocery store sat in the middle of a vast, empty parking lot, bathed in the faint glow of streetlights. It was 2 a.m. The store was closed, and the eerie quiet surrounded it. The night was still, until a soft tapping on the glass echoed in the darkness. I was the night shift manager here. Usually, things were calm, and nothing happened. It was just me, stocking shelves during the quiet hours while the outside world slept. I had been working non-stop since my shift began at 10 p.m., trying to get everything done. My focus was broken when I heard the faint tapping. It was coming from the front of the store. I left my cart and headed toward the sound. Through the large glass windows, I saw him, a man. He was leaning against the glass, trying to peer inside. His clothes were tattered, his face expressionless, with a hollow, vacant look in his eyes. He saw me the moment I came into view. I approached the glass door. I asked him what he wanted. He demanded I open the door. His face was emotionless. No hint of a smile, just cold eyes staring at me. I told him the store was closed and that he couldn't be here. As I turned to walk away, a loud bang startled me. The man's fists were pounding on the glass, over and over, each strike louder and angrier than the last. My heart raced. This guy wasn't just a harmless drifter. I pulled out my phone, showing him I was ready to call the police. Only then did he back off, his eyes still locked on me, filled with rage. Slowly, he stepped back into the shadows of the parking lot. The tension in me eased slightly. He was gone. I put my phone away and tried to focus back on my work. 15 minutes passed. The tapping, the pounding, the man, all of it faded from my mind as I immersed myself in stocking the shelves. But then I heard it, the sound of metal breaking, like something being torn apart. I abandoned the stroller and ran forward, fear rising. My heart sank when I saw the glass door slightly open. The lock, the only thing that kept the door secure, was missing. Fear gripped me as I realized what this meant. I need to go to the office, call the police now. I turned to run for the office, but I froze in place. Standing not far from me, blocking my path, was the man. His expression hadn't changed, still cold, still lifeless, filled with rage. I don't think anything. I just run. I burst through the door, the man right behind me. Suddenly, a beat-up van screeched into view, speeding toward the front of the store. It swerved dangerously, nearly hitting me as it stopped, my heart pounding in my chest. I moved forward, running past the van, but then everything flipped upside down. A sharp pain suddenly exploded at the back of my head. My body lurched forward as I fell to the ground. I didn't even have time to process what had happened before the world started fading. I felt hands grabbing me, roughly lifting me off the cold pavement. My vision blurred, darkness closing in, and the last thing I remembered was the roar of the van's engine and the sensation of being dragged inside. I woke up with a throbbing headache, my wrists tightly bound behind me. The van bounced and swayed as it sped down an unfamiliar road. My mind was foggy, disoriented. For a moment, I didn't know where I was. Then it all came rushing back. I started to string it together. Man, the truck. Perhaps I was kidnapped by him. My heart raced as I realized I needed to act, and fast. I glanced around. Inside, it was pitch black, but I could make out a pile of old tools, a rusted toolbox, and some scattered metal pieces on the floor. I twisted my wrists, testing the ropes. They were tight, but I could feel a slight give, just enough to give me hope. I could hear the driver muttering to himself up front. His voice was low, angry. This wasn't over. I took a deep breath, calming the panic rising inside me. I needed to think, and I needed to get out. I inched closer to the toolbox, my fingers searching for anything sharp. It was hard, but I found a small, jagged piece of rusted metal. I awkwardly twisted my hands, rubbing the metal against the ropes. My heart pounded with every noise the van made, every bump in the road that might expose me, each one painful enough to make me want to scream. Suddenly, I felt the ropes loosen. A few more scratches and they snapped. My wrists were free, but I couldn't move too quickly. I glanced toward the front seat, where I could see the back of the driver's head. He hadn't realized I was awake yet. I noticed the door latch wasn't locked. I needed a plan. The van slowed as it made a sharp turn onto a dirt road. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Taking a deep breath, I yanked the back door open and jumped into the night. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my body as I tumbled over dirt and gravel. For a second, I thought I wouldn't be able to move, but adrenaline surged through me. I staggered to my feet, running into the thick darkness of the trees. Behind me, the van screeched to a stop. I heard the man shouting, his footsteps pounding as he chased after me, but I didn't look back. I just kept running, my heart hammering in my chest. The trees, the branches, scratched at my skin as I tore through the dense underbrush. My mind was foggy, teetering between fear and survival. I could hear the man crashing through the forest behind me, his breath heavy and furious. I couldn't let him catch me again. Ahead, I spotted a clearing and the faint glow of lights through the trees. A road. If I could get there fast, I'd be safe. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, waving my arms frantically as a car approached. The headlights blinded me, but I didn't care. I needed help. I ran into the middle of the road, screaming for them to stop. The car screeched to a halt, and I collapsed against the hood, gasping for breath. The driver jumped out, shouting something, but I was too exhausted to answer. All I could do was whisper, "Help me." The driver pulled out his phone, calling the police. I glanced back at the man. He stood at the edge of the woods, staring at me with cold, furious eyes. But he didn't come any closer. He knew it was over. The flashing lights of police cars lit up the dark road. Officers surrounded the van. The man already in handcuffs not far away. His face was cold, blank, disturbingly empty. I sat on the curb, still trembling, wrapped in a blanket the police had given me. The world felt strange, like a nightmare I couldn't wake from. But I was grateful, lucky to be alive. I was free. The police assured me that he'd be locked away, that he wouldn't hurt anyone else. But the thought still lingered in my mind. What if I hadn't escaped? What if I hadn't been fast enough? As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, I stood by the car, watching the police take the man away. The fear was still there, clinging to the edges of my mind, but I knew I had survived. I had been lucky to survive the night shift. Scary night at the toy store. The night sky was heavy, and the large parking lot outside a quiet toy store was dimly lit by a few sparse streetlights. The store was about to close, and Sana, a woman in her 30s, walked toward the entrance. She held a list tightly in her hand. Her daughter's 6th birthday was coming up soon. Inside, the store was nearly empty. Sana walked past shelves filled with toys. She felt excited as she picked up stuffed animals and birthday decorations. As she walked, she had the unsettling feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over and saw a man at the end of the aisle. He wore a long black coat and had a hat pulled low over his face. He just stood there, staring at her. Sana immediately looked away, pretending not to notice, but she could feel his eyes burning into her. She grabbed the last item on her list and moved to a different aisle, hoping to shake the strange and uneasy feeling. For the next 15 minutes, she tried to continue shopping, moving through different parts of the store. She hurried through checkout, her nerves on edge. After paying, she headed for the exit. The parking lot was almost empty, except for her car and a suspicious gray SUV parked nearby. The vast emptiness made the SUV's proximity unsettling. As she neared her car, Sana's heart raced when she heard a car door open from the other side of the SUV. The man in the black coat emerged from around the SUV. It was the same man from the store. Her fear began to rise as she recognized him. She thought she needed to hide for a while. Sana hurried inside, her breath quickening. The store was nearly empty now, and the isolation was overwhelming. She moved through the aisles, trying to lose the man in the maze of shelves. Every few minutes, she glanced over her shoulder. The man was there, trailing her through the store. He kept his distance but never let her out of his sight. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. She quickly dialed her husband, and when he answered, she whispered urgently into the phone. He promised he would be there in less than 10 minutes. The minutes felt like hours as she moved around the store, pretending to browse but always keeping an eye on the man. At one point, he seemed to lose interest and walked toward the exit, but as Sana neared the checkout counter, he lined up right behind her. The air felt stifling. She quickly moved through rows of stuffed animals and dolls, praying that the man wouldn't see her anymore. She crouched behind a shelf, pressing her back against it. She looked around, but didn't see him anywhere. For a moment, she dared to hope that he had really left. But then, the soft sound of footsteps on the floor shattered her illusion of safety. He rounded the corner, his figure looming larger as he got closer. Sana's back pressed against the shelf, and a row of dolls wobbled. She flinched in fear as one of them fell to the ground with a soft thud. The man stopped just a few feet away. She glanced, her eyes alert, watching his every move. This close, she could make out more details. His gloved hands, the lower part of his face visible beneath the brim of his hat. A faint, crooked smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. He took another step toward her. He reached into his coat, and for a moment, Sana's heart stopped. Was he pulling out a weapon? What was he about to do? Suddenly, headlights swept across the parking lot as a car pulled in. Sana's husband had arrived, and his car stopped right in front of the toy store. The man glanced toward the lights, his expression stiffening, growing cautious. He stepped back into the shadows as Sana's husband drew closer. Sana saw her husband get out of the car. He walked toward the store, his eyes scanning the parking lot for her. She seized the moment and ran past the man, her heart pounding as she sprinted toward the store entrance. She didn't look back, but she could feel his eyes burning into her as she escaped. Sana rushed through the front door of the store, running toward her husband. Her face was pale, and her hands were trembling, but she was safe. She collapsed into his arms, her breath coming in gasps as the fear that had overwhelmed her began to fade. Her husband looked past her, scanning the store for the man, but the parking lot had returned to its eerie calm. The man in the black coat had disappeared, melting into the shadows. Her husband gripped the steering wheel, ready to drive them home, but Sana couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Later that night, Sana's phone rang. It was a call from the local police station. The man had been caught. They wanted her to come in and give a statement. The man had been arrested just hours after leaving the parking lot. A patrol car had spotted his SUV parked suspiciously in another lot near a shopping mall. When the police approached him casually, he resisted arrest, acting erratically. Sana listened intently as the detective began revealing disturbing details that had come to light after his arrest. During questioning, the man, identified as Dennis, initially refused to cooperate. He claimed he was just shopping late and looking for lost car keys, but his story quickly unraveled. The police found disturbing evidence inside his SUV, items that made Sana's skin crawl. First, there was a knife, wrapped in cloth and hidden under the passenger seat. It wasn't an ordinary knife. The blade was worn, and the handle was smooth from years of use. Next to it was a set of duct tape, rope, and zip ties, all stashed in a small canvas bag. Dennis had likely planned something far worse than just following her. The real horror came when they found the photos. Many were of women, all taken from a distance, some in grocery stores, others as they left malls, a few while walking their dogs. And then Sana's breath caught in her throat. Scattered among the pictures were photos of her, some from the toy store that night, and many others taken before. They were taken when she dropped her daughter off at school, when she went grocery shopping, and even when she left her apartment. Realizing Dennis had been following her for days, maybe weeks, made her feel sick. As the investigation continued, more terrifying truths about Dennis emerged. He often stalked women, but none of his victims had ever filed charges. He was disturbingly careful, always skirting the edges of the law, always evading arrest or detection. 2 years earlier, in another town, Dennis had been investigated for the disappearance of a woman, though no evidence was ever found. The case had since gone cold. Sana was horrified to realize she could have easily become another cold case, another missing person, if her husband hadn't arrived in time that night. The police assured her Dennis would be locked up and no longer a threat. Sana and her husband left the police station. They drove home in the quiet darkness. She glanced over at her husband, grateful that he had arrived just in time. But deep down, a new sense of caution had been born. She would never let her guard down like that again. Mysterious driver in the desert. Gavi was driving down an empty desert highway, stretching for miles, barren and silent. He had been driving for hours. The only sound was the crackling of his car's radio, which seemed to be breaking down, with only static and the occasional country tune. This was one of the rare times Gavi passed through here. He glanced at his dashboard map. No towns, no gas stations for miles. Just an empty, desolate road. As Gavi approached a small hill on the road, he felt a sense of relief. The slight slope broke the endless flatness, providing a brief change. But as he went downhill, something caught his attention in the distance. At first, he couldn't tell what it was. Just a shape, a dark figure faintly illuminated by the moonlight. But as he got closer, the figure took form of a person standing on the side of the road. Gavi slowed down, squinting to get a better look. It was a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She wore a long white dress and had pale skin. Her long black hair hung over her face as if soaked in water. Gavi muttered, wondering what she was doing out here. There was nothing for miles. No cars, no houses. How did she even get here? Gavi slowed the car further, considering whether to stop. Maybe she was lost. But as he got closer, something sent a chill down his spine. Her hair looked too wet, as if she had just walked out of a rainstorm, even though the desert had been dry for weeks. And her face, what little he could see of it, her eyes were too large, unblinking, staring straight at Gavi through the wet strands of hair. He hit the gas, speeding past her in fear. Even though he tried to convince himself she was just a lost traveler or perhaps a prank, Gavi couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. Minutes passed, and Gavi continued driving through the endless desert, the eerie calm returning. He kept glancing in the rear-view mirror, feeling as if someone was watching him. He shook his head, trying to stay focused, but then Gavi saw another hill in the distance, just like the one he had passed earlier. And after a short drive, there she was again. The same woman, the same white dress, the same wet hair covering her face. But this time, she was closer to the road, and her smile was even wider, more unnatural. Gavi couldn't believe his eyes. How could she have gotten here before him? There was no way she could have moved that fast. He didn't think twice and slammed his foot on the gas, speeding forward to get past her. This time, Gavi didn't dare look back. Another hill appeared ahead, and the familiar fear tightened in Gavi's chest. He didn't want to go over it, didn't want to see her again, but he had no choice. His worst fear came true. She was there again, standing and waving at him. Her smile now impossibly wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, and her cold, soulless eyes stared directly at Gavi. Maybe she was some sort of hallucination conjured by his imagination. No matter how much he tried, the fear continued to gnaw at him. He had heard the stories of haunted highways, of strange ghosts appearing to night travelers, but he had never believed them until now. He couldn't keep driving and needed to stop to escape this cursed road. But there was no exit, no rest stop. Gavi felt trapped with no way out. And then, the radio started crackling again. He reached out with a trembling hand to adjust the dial. But before he could turn it off, Gavi felt something cold touch the back of his neck. He froze. Reaching from behind the driver's seat was a pair of pale white hands. The fingers wrapped around his face, slowly digging their nails into his skin. Gavi was now about to face something he didn't understand, and he still had a secret he was hiding. Mysterious driver in the desert. Those fingers, they were slowly tightening around Gavi's face. They were icy cold. Cold like the touch of death itself. He was frozen in place. Slowly, with fear creeping down his spine, he turned to look. Gavi couldn't see the face those hands belonged to, but he had the sense it was a woman. Was it the woman? The one he'd passed many times on the highway? His mind was flooded with horror. The car swerved violently as the grip on him tightened. The tires screeched against the road. The car was losing control. The car veered off the highway, crashing into the rocky terrain with a sharp, grating sound. The impact was brutal, throwing him against the steering wheel as the airbag deployed. Pain surged through his body. Gavi's head hit the window, and for a moment, everything seemed to blur. Smoke rose from the crumpled hood, the headlights flickering dimly on the dark horizon. Gavi's vision swam as he tried to focus. He was still alive. Gavi could feel blood trickling down one side of his face. His limbs were heavy, weighed down. He tried to move, but his body wouldn't respond. Then, he blacked out. In the distance, a car approached. The officer, a seasoned man who had seen his share of accidents, stepped out of his vehicle, his flashlight cutting through the desert's dark night. The car was a wreck. Twisted metal and shattered glass scattered across the rocky ground. Smoke still rose from the engine. The officer cautiously approached. The officer, Jay, shone his flashlight through the driver's side window. His eyes widened in shock when he saw the body still strapped into the seatbelt. After checking the license plate, he realized it was someone named Gavi. His head was twisted at a strange angle. almost wrenched to the side, and his eyes wouldn't close, wide open as if staring right at me, his face frozen in a horrifying grimace, blood smeared across his skin. But just as Jay started to step back, he heard something. A sound like someone crying, but it was muffled, as if something was blocking their mouth. The sound came from the trunk. At first, it was faint, barely audible. But as Jay leaned in to investigate, it grew louder, more desperate. It was a sobbing, painful cry, like that of a child trapped inside. Panic surged through the officer as he ran to the back of the car. His hands trembled as he fumbled with the trunk latch. Jay's mind raced with questions. Who could be inside? What had happened? 2 cases at once? The trunk lid sprang open. Jay's flashlight illuminated a haunting sight inside the cramped trunk, a little girl. A young girl, bound and gagged. Her wrists and ankles were tied tightly with thick, rough rope, and her mouth was sealed with tape. Tears streamed down her pale face, her eyes wide with fear. Not just that clutched tightly to her chest was a doll. The doll wore a white dress, its skin pale and cracked with age, its face fixed in a disturbingly wide smile. Large, dark eyes stared back, and its long black hair appeared wet, hanging loose. Jay reached out to touch the doll, and then its head moved. The girl sobbed, her body trembling as she clung to the doll. Jay staggered back, the weight of the doll's gaze pressing on him. He turned away, his breath becoming ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. The officer fought back his rising panic. It was just a coincidence, he told himself. He quickly untied the girl and removed the tape from her mouth. She gasped for air, sobbing loudly. Jay reassured the girl and led her to his patrol car. He called for backup. From the moment they got into the car, the doll sat there, staring at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him, studying him with its eerie and unsettling gaze. Soon after, backup and paramedics arrived. The girl was taken to the hospital, still clutching the doll, which baffled him. Her small hands clung to it as if it were the only thing tethering her. As the ambulance drove away, Jay remained haunted by the strange presence of the doll. He pondered the mysterious events leading up to the crash. Even though the girl had been rescued, the story felt far from over. It seemed to have slipped beyond Jay's understanding, perhaps into another world entirely. The Clown in the Tree. This happened to me when I was 14. It was the same year everyone was talking about creepy clowns lurking in random places. The stories were everywhere, but I never took them seriously until I had an encounter of my own. I was sitting alone in the living room. My parents had gone to my grandparents' house for the evening, leaving me home by myself. But instead of feeling free, there was a strange unease I couldn't shake. I texted some friends, inviting them over to kill time John and Emma. We played video games for a while, but after a few hours, we got bored. John had an idea. He said, "Let's go into the woods." There was a forest right behind my house that we usually avoided, especially at night. But it was still light out, and with nothing else to do, I agreed. We gathered ourselves and headed out. Part of me regretted it as soon as we left the house. The forest was dense, tall trees casting cool shade, but we weren't scared. We joked around, tossed sticks, and laughed about nothing. We had been there for about 20 or 30 minutes when we heard something strange. Someone was crying. The sound was faint but unmistakable, like sobbing, desperate, coming from deep within the trees. We all stopped, staring at each other. John was the first to break the silence, whispering tensely, "What the hell is that?" None of us knew, and Emma suggested we go check it out. I wanted to say no, but before I could, everyone was already heading towards the sound. My heart started pounding harder with each step. Something felt wrong. like we were walking into a place we shouldn't. As we got closer, we saw a figure slumped on a large branch of an old tree. It was a man, dressed as a clown. His outfit was white with black polka dots, but it was stained and torn. He wore a black wig, but it was messy, and his makeup was smeared by what looked like tears. He just sat there, quietly crying. John, being the idiot he was, yelled, "Hey, you idiot! Why are you crying up there?" A chill ran down my spine, and I instantly turned to John, telling him to shut up. But it was too late. The clown looked down at us, his tear-streaked face twisting into a smile. His lips curled upward, but it was hollow, as if he was trying to express something through invisible pain. And then I saw it, his hand, gripping a large machete, the blade covered in what looked like blood. We were frozen. He just sat there, staring at us, his smile widening grotesquely, yet his eyes were cold, emotionless. He said, "You won't understand, but when I show you, you will." Panic surged through me, and without thinking, I screamed, "Run!" We scattered, running in all directions. My heart pounded, my feet barely touching the ground as I sprinted towards home. The forest seemed endless, branches scratching at my skin as I ran. I could hear the others screaming, their voices fading as we were separated. I reached the edge of the woods, sprinting into my backyard. I didn't stop until I was inside, slamming the door behind me. Then, I waited for my friends. Emma made it back, panting and pale with fear. But John wasn't with us. We waited for him, hoping he'd burst through the door, laughing about how scared we were. But then we waited, and no one came. We called the police. They came and searched the forest. We told them everything: the clown, the machete, the crying. They didn't seem surprised. It turned out the man we saw was a local. He had been on the run for days. The police said he was a heavy drug user who had killed his wife and left her body wrapped in a white sheet. The next day, they found John. He was dead, discovered in a deep lake in the forest. The man must have chased him while the rest of us ran. I couldn't believe it. John was gone, just like that. And it was my fault for agreeing to go into that forest. If I hadn't, maybe he would still be alive. I told my parents everything, and they promised never to leave me home alone again. But it didn't help much. I couldn't sleep for weeks, and when I did, I had nightmares of the clown standing in the forest, smiling at me with his blood-stained machete. It's been 5 years since that night. I'm 19 now, but the memory of what happened in the forest is still burned into my mind. John's disappearance and the discovery of his body in the lake. It haunts me. No one ever talked about it after the police closed the case. A tragic accident, they said. A drug-crazed maniac. But I knew there was more to it. For years, I pushed the memories down, but recently, they've started to resurface. It began with nightmares, the image of the clown, his twisted smile. But lately, it's been more real, as if he's not just in my dreams anymore. Something is coming for me. I've started feeling like I'm being watched again, just like back then. And tonight, I swear I saw him, standing at the edge of the forest behind my house, staring at me. I grabbed a flashlight, pepper spray, and a taser. I don't even know what I was thinking, but I couldn't sit here, paralyzed by fear anymore. The only way to end this is to go back to where it all started. The air was thick with silence as I stepped outside, the flashlight casting weak beams through the trees. The moment I entered the forest, each step felt heavier than the last, as if the woods themselves were pulling me deeper into the darkness. I didn't know where I was going, but my legs seemed to remember the way. Soon enough, I found myself back at the place where we had first seen the clown crying. Suddenly, The rustling of leaves shattered the silence. I froze. The sound of snapping twigs grew closer. I slowly turned around. The flashlight shook in my trembling hands, illuminating a figure perched on a branch, whistling. It was him. He looked just like before, his white clothes smeared with dirt and something darker dried blood. His black wig was still a tangled mess. He just sat there, staring, holding the machete. The clown tilted his head, his smile twisting even more as he jumped down effortlessly, walking slowly, deliberately toward me. He said, "Welcome back." I was so angry I almost cried, yelling that I knew what he had done to John. The clown's smile faded, replaced by a fake look of pity. "You don't understand," he whispered. "I didn't kill him. He chose it." I shook my head, backing away. His words. When I ran, I remembered seeing John hesitate, standing still. He didn't seem scared, more like mesmerized. And what he said before we ran into the woods, he looks sad, doesn't he? I snapped back to reality as the clown got closer, saying that when it was my turn, I'd understand. His words hit me like a punch. I stumbled backward, tripping over a fallen branch. The flashlight slipped from my hand, flickering as it rolled across the ground. Darkness enveloped me, and I reached to grab it, but the clown's footsteps were closer now. I looked up and saw him towering over me, raising the machete. I pulled the pepper spray from my pocket and sprayed it. He staggered for a moment. But then I heard a voice that sounded like John's. "Alex, you need to leave." I don't know how. I didn't look back at the clown. I just ran. His laughter echoed behind me. Suddenly, I was standing in my backyard, alone. The forest was quiet now, the house dark and still. I rushed inside and called the police, convinced he was still out there. When the police arrived this time, he was there. They found him crouched near the lake, clutching the machete. His clothes were soaked in blood and dirt. He didn't resist when they approached. Later, they interrogated him for hours. The clown believed he was chosen to lead people to the other side. The police dismissed it as the ramblings of a madman. But even then, I knew something darker was at play. Underground parking and mysterious people. I worked the night shift at an apartment complex downtown. The job seemed simple enough: monitor cameras, patrol, and ensure the building's security. The building was constructed in the late 60s, and its design left many vulnerable entry points in the parking garage. The association was concerned about security, especially with the occasional break-ins and homeless people finding shelter in the hidden corners of the basement. I had worked here for months, and every night I would check every nook and cranny. Most nights were quiet, normal, even boring. Until tonight. I walked through the dimly lit parking garage, my footsteps echoing. The place was a maze of dead spaces and blind spots. Too many places to hide. Too many areas the cameras couldn't see. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing only parked cars and empty spaces. I always hated the door that led to a dead-end hallway. It was an isolated corridor that led nowhere. Just a locked door that couldn't be opened from the inside, as if it held some history better left unknown. As I approached the door, it was wide open. A cold wave of fear washed over me. The door was supposed to be locked tight. I swept my flashlight down the narrow hallway. There was nothing, just an empty glass bottle lying on the ground. My anxiety spiked. The thought of stepping into the hallway made me uneasy. I didn't want to get trapped in there, especially knowing the door locked from the outside. But procedure is procedure. I had to follow it, and I couldn't just leave the bottle there. Reluctantly, I stepped inside. I moved toward the bottle, my flashlight reflecting off the cold gray walls. Each step felt heavier than the last. I bent down, picked up the bottle, and stood up. But then, the sound that chilled me to the bone, the door slammed shut behind me. I rushed to the door, panic rising in my chest, and grabbed the handle. It was locked. I pounded on the metal door, screaming for help, but the thick concrete walls swallowed my cries. My heart raced as I realized no one was coming. It was 3 a.m. and I was trapped. I tried my phone, no signal. The thick walls and metal door blocked everything. I was completely cut off from the outside world. I leaned against the cold wall, trying to calm myself down. The flashlight was my only lifeline in the stifling darkness. I switched it off to save the battery, but I could still hear echoes from somewhere. Then the sound of car alarms blared, one after the other. Whoever had locked me in was out there, doing whatever they wanted, smashing car doors, stealing whatever they could. After what felt like hours, I heard footsteps. It was a miracle. Someone was out there, and I had to make them hear me. I pounded on the door with all my strength, shouting loudly. Finally, a deep, raspy voice answered from the other side, and after a moment, the lock clicked. The door opened, and I felt a wave of relief. A passerby, on their way to work early, had heard my banging. I thanked them profusely as I stumbled out of the hallway, my legs shaking, but my relief didn't last long. As I returned to the basement, chaos greeted me. Windows were shattered, glass littered the concrete floor. At least a dozen cars had been broken into, valuable items stolen. Whoever locked me in knew exactly what they were doing. They had silenced the alarms after each car was hit, leaving behind damage worth tens of thousands of dollars. My heart sank. I knew what was coming next. When the morning shift arrived and the residents discovered the theft, the police would be called, and I would be fired. Security had been breached under my watch, and though it wasn't my fault, I was the one held responsible. Weeks later, after I had quit, the mystery still haunted me. I replayed the events of that night over and over in my head. How did they know exactly where to trap me? How did they avoid the cameras so perfectly? No one was ever caught. The footage showed nothing, just me, doing my rounds. As I walked, I didn't see a thing. Maybe they knew the blind spots of the place too well. Months had passed, but tonight, that phone call pulled me back to the core of everything. I walked into the parking garage. I approached the dead-end hallway, my heart pounding harder with every step. The door was ajar. Just like that night, I could feel the weight of the past pressing on me, daring me to confront it. There was something I missed before. I stood at the entrance, staring, then cautiously moved forward as my senses sharpened. This time, I was ready for whatever I might face. No more running. Then I saw him. It was probably the man who trapped me. His gaunt face was pale and dirty, his hollow eyes fixed on me. He stood still, almost like a statue, as if he had been waiting for me all this time. A chill ran down my spine. The man wasn't a ghost or a specter, he was real. My voice trembled as I spoke. "Who are you? Why did you do this?" The man didn't move at first, but then, slowly, a twisted smile spread across his face, growing wider. He started walking toward me. He started saying something I didn't understand, talking about how I would soon see for myself the secret of this place, the truth I had been afraid of and running from. He said he wasn't just some random drifter that night, and that he had been here much longer than I thought. This building, this place, it wasn't just concrete and steel. It was a prison, and people like him, they were trapped inside. For a moment, his expression darkened. He told me that there are things in this world that feed on fear and suffering. And places like this, they are where they hunt. Now, he was part of its cycle. My mind raced as I tried to understand what he was saying. The truth hit me, and I realized this man wasn't just some random criminal. He was a victim of something much darker, something that had taken hold of him and was now trying to take me too. I stepped back, my heart pounding. I'm not like you. I can still get out of this. His smile widened again, sinister and mocking. I turned, glancing at the door, thinking about running. I clenched my fists, took one last look at the man, then turned and sprinted toward the door. I could hear his laughter echoing behind me, filling the narrow hallway. I ran through the parking garage, then stopped. Standing there, in the darkness, was another figure, identical to the man in the hallway. I froze. This couldn't be happening. More figures appeared, stepping out from the shadows. Each one looked just like him, pale, gaunt. Maybe they weren't real, but they felt so real, their malicious energy surrounding me. I staggered. That man hadn't been lying. This place, this building, it was still alive. It had taken him, just as it had taken others before him. And now it was my turn. But I wasn't going to let that happen. With one last surge of strength, I got up and ran, not stopping until I was far away from the building, the figures fading into the night behind me. I didn't look back. Safe in my apartment, I sat in the dark, the truth of that night still sinking in. The man, the building. I had escaped, but deep down I knew it wouldn't be that simple. I needed to stay far away from that place and never go back. Ghosts in the warehouse. I am a warehouse worker for a small business in my city. I just do certain tasks that need to be done each night. I unload the goods that are delivered and place everything in its proper place. Most of the time, I just wear headphones and listen to music while I work because the warehouse isn't too big. It's rare for someone else to be working overnight with me. The night drags on slowly. The warehouse is eerily quiet, with the only sound being the creaking of the old building. My shift started at 10 o'clock, and there were perhaps some knocking sounds between 12 o'clock and 1 o'clock a.m. I stopped, took off my headphones, and tried to listen to the sound again, but it had stopped. As I returned to work, the knocking resumed, this time louder, more persistent. I froze, facing the source of the sound, a narrow, dark aisle flanked by towering shelves. The knocking stopped when I reached the aisle, leaving only darkness. As I neared the front of the warehouse, I noticed the front door slightly ajar. Confused, I recalled that I had locked it when I arrived. I walked up and pushed the door open, finding the latch broken. I quickly locked the door again, this time jamming a nearby metal bar against it for extra security. But the gesture felt futile. Determined to finish my shift, I returned to my duties, but my focus was shattered. Every creak of the building, every flicker of the lights felt like a warning. Suddenly, the overhead lights flickered and went out, plunging the warehouse into darkness. I pulled out my flashlight to cut through the blackness. The beam revealed only empty aisles, but the feeling of being watched lingered. As I moved through the warehouse, the flashlight caught fleeting glimpses of shadows darting out of sight, too quick to be fully seen. My fear surged as I raced towards the front door. I saw the metal bar I had wedged into the door bent and twisted. I turned to face the darkness, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The light revealed a tall, indistinct figure watching me from the shadows. I started breathing rapidly. The figure moved slowly towards me, its footsteps echoing loudly in the silent warehouse. In a last desperate act, I threw the flashlight at the figure and dashed into the darkness, hoping to find another way out. My frantic sprint led me to the back door of the warehouse. But just as I was about to escape, the door slammed shut, as if someone from behind had done it. I panicked and turned around, but as I was about to run back, my flashlight suddenly flickered back on, illuminating a reflection of myself in a large mirror hidden behind some old boxes. But it wasn't me. A darker version, with a blurred face, slowly raised its hand, moving while I stood frozen. It seemed to be hypnotizing me, trying to pull me somewhere. It said, "Follow me," and then gave a terrifying smile. I stumbled, too frightened to think, and grabbed the door handle, yanking it with all my strength, then ran outside, gasping for air as the fog seemed to swallow me whole. As I ran, I heard footsteps again, echoing through the mist. I turned around, but the warehouse was almost invisible through the thick fog. I collapsed to the ground, exhausted, as I turned back to face whatever was chasing me, but there was nothing there. I pulled out my phone and called the police, trembling with fear. When they finally arrived, they thoroughly searched the warehouse, but found no trace of an intruder. If I hadn't realized the door was broken, I would have faced that strange thing directly, with no way of knowing what would have happened. Although unlikely, I can't shake the feeling that it's still chasing me. So I quit the job, hoping I'll never encounter it again. The man passed through the door. It was a quiet evening. Abby was home alone as usual. Her mother often had to work 2 jobs in one day, from morning to late at night. So Abby had to take care of herself most of the time, and she was used to it. The house was peaceful. Her mother wouldn't be home for hours, so she took care of everything herself, from cooking to locking up, getting ready for bed. Before going to bed, Abby planned to relax a bit. She sat on the couch, ready to watch TV with a tub of ice cream in her hand. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. She froze, spoon of ice cream halfway to her mouth. It was strange her friends never visited this late, and her mom always used her key. Confused, she slowly walked to the door. She wasn't exactly scared, just curious. She opened the door and saw him a man. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking on. He was bald, wore thick glasses, and had a scruffy beard with dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. He didn't seem threatening, but something felt off. Abby greeted him, and the man smiled and asked, "Hello, little girl. Are your parents home?" At the time, she didn't think much of it, assuming it was just a friendly question. So Abby foolishly answered that her mom wasn't home. A smile spread across his face, but then she started to feel uneasy as his questions grew too interested. He smiled and said, "Good night. Don't get into any trouble," then walked away. Abby didn't understand what had just happened, so she closed the door. Her heart was racing, but she pushed it aside. He was just being friendly, she told herself. Abby returned to her ice cream. Her mind replayed the conversation. Something about the way he had looked at her and smiled made her feel uneasy. 10 minutes passed, and she began to feel comfortable again. The strange encounter faded from her mind. Then, there was another knock at the door. She thought it might be him again. This time, something told her to be cautious. She wasn't sure why, but before opening the door, she decided to lock the chain. When Abby opened the door, the chain caught, preventing it from opening fully. And there he was, the same man from earlier. His eyes widened in surprise, and for a moment, he pretended to be friendly again. He stammered a greeting to Abby again, and said he just wanted to make sure she was okay. To her, he no longer seemed friendly. He looked desperate, as if realizing he hadn't gotten into the house and was trying to cover it up. Abby gave a quick thank you out of fear and slammed the door shut, her hands trembling as she locked it. She stood there, frozen, staring at the door. Minutes passed, and she couldn't stop thinking about the man. But every sound, every creak of the house made her jump. She needed her mom and wished she were home. Suddenly, she heard the man's voice again, this time coming from the mail slot of the front door. He was whispering through the slot, saying he wanted to come in and had something to tell Abby. Abby froze in place. She screamed, "Leave me alone." The mail slot slammed shut, and then the pounding on the door started. He was banging hard, rattling the doorknob violently, shouting crude words demanding she open the door. She stumbled back, tears streaming down her face, silently praying he wouldn't get in. The banging grew louder, more frantic, as he tried to force the door open. For what felt like an eternity, Abby stood there, sobbing, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. Perhaps the man had given up and left. She didn't move, only standing there, listening. About 30 minutes later, Abby's mom came home. The door opened, and she rushed in, finding her daughter in tears. Abby told her everything. Her mom immediately called the police about the incident, but they didn't find any trace of the man. As Abby lay in bed that night, she couldn't stop thinking about how lucky she was to have used the door chain. It was a small, almost insignificant decision, but it had saved her. The house is haunted. When I was a child, I lived with my parents and younger brother in a large, beautiful house. But that house wasn't always ours. It used to be an old police station. At first, everything seemed perfect, but there was something deeply unsettling about the place. It all started when I couldn't sleep in one specific. As a baby, I cried endlessly until my parents decided to move me to another room, leaving that bedroom for my brother. Years passed, and by the time I turned 5, the nightmares began. They weren't ordinary nightmares, they were terrifying. There was always someone visiting me whenever I slept. Sometimes it was a woman in a white dress standing at the foot of my bed, other times a man in a police uniform. Their presence made it impossible for me to sleep peacefully. Especially that man, every night. He chased me in my dreams without knowing the reason. In my dream, I would run, but no matter how fast I ran, he would always be right behind me. I called for help but couldn't. Night after night, I wandered through my nightmares, waking up screaming in terror. It all felt disturbingly real. Some nights, he would sit on my bed, his twisted smile inches from my face, staring at me without blinking. All I could do was silently cry and beg for mercy. Not only was I affected, but my parents were exhausted from the sleepless nights. My mother always tried to reassure me, but I could see him standing right behind her, watching and smirking. Of course, my mother couldn't see him. The worst part was that even when I was awake, I could still feel his presence somewhere in the house. It followed me everywhere, like a shadow always lurking behind me. A dark figure standing still, observing. I felt as though I was living in a haunted house. I could feel him behind me as I ran up the stairs, his breath on the back of my neck. I started running up and down the stairs, but I couldn't escape the feeling that he was always right there, just out of reach. When I was a teenager, I finally opened up to my mother, recounting every detail about the terrifying figure that had tormented me for years. Her face turned pale as I spoke. She told me something that made my skin crawl. Our house, once a police station, was haunted by the spirit of an officer who had been anything but friendly in life. When he died, his spirit returned to the building and refused to leave. As it turned out, his office was the very room I couldn't sleep in as a child. That room was now my brother's bedroom. My mother had also seen him and felt his presence, but it didn't stop there. My brother had seen him too, and what he told me sent chills down my spine. Last year, when my brother was 16, the man appeared to him as well, yelling at him to get out of his office. My brother, strangely calm, replied, "No, this is my room now. You're dead. You need to leave." Over time, the man's attitude softened, and they began to coexist, even talking to each other occasionally. I was shocked. My brother had been living with this terrifying presence for years, but had kept it all to himself. I asked him why he had never told anyone. He simply said he knew no one would believe him. Eventually, we moved out when my little sister was born. The new house was free of ghosts, and I was relieved to finally leave that nightmare behind after 8 long years. But what about my brother? For the first 2 years in our new house, the man still visited him. But he was different now, no longer frightening, just visiting, as if he had found some peace. My brother said he no longer sees him and believes the man has finally found rest. Hearing that, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The nightmare was over. The man had moved on. But to this day, my brother and I can still see ghosts. Yet none has ever frightened me like that man from the police station. Headless bus passenger. Late at night, the university campus was eerily quiet and shrouded in darkness. Kala hurried toward the campus bus stop after a long evening of studying. The long, empty street was lit by only a few dim streetlights. There was only one bus left at the stop, its headlights cutting through. The cold, misty air. She boarded the bus, her eyes briefly glancing at the driver, a man well into his years, his face lined with deep wrinkles and dark, unreadable eyes. Kala sat in the middle of the bus, trying to relax, but she suddenly sensed something strange. Through the rearview mirror, she realized the driver was staring at her intently. His eyes never left her, as if he was searching for something on her face. After a few minutes, she began to feel something was wrong. The route they were taking was unfamiliar. Instead of heading toward her dormitory, they were drifting into a desolate area where thick darkness swallowed everything. She leaned over, peering out the window, looking around in growing confusion. Kala turned to remind the driver about her destination, but he didn't respond. His eyes were no longer on the mirror, but fixed straight ahead. He pressed on the gas, speeding up, ignoring the narrow, winding roads. Kala's fear surged. She raised her voice.
"This isn't the way to my dorm."
But the driver didn't hear or didn't care. His face had gone pale, as though he was terrified of something unseen. Suddenly, the bus swayed, and vague shapes began to materialize outside the windows. At first, they were shadows of people standing by the roadside. Then they became clearer faces with empty eyes, mouths wide open as if screaming in silent agony. They stood there, watching like bloodthirsty specters. Kala curled up, trembling, too afraid to look at those ghostly figures for long. She felt like screaming. After what felt like an eternity, the bus finally slowed down. The familiar sight of the dormitory building appeared ahead, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. Without wasting time, she grabbed her backpack and hurried off the bus. As she stepped onto the sidewalk, she heard the driver's voice for the first time that night. His voice was low, trembling, and filled with an urgency that sent chills down her spine. The driver's words were brief, but they hit Kala hard.
Wait!
His voice was tense. The driver told her that when he looked in the mirror earlier, he didn't see her head, only a headless body sitting where she was. He had been driving in circles, trying to shake off the spirit he believed had latched onto her. He couldn't hear her when she spoke because, in his eyes, she had already disappeared. He then warned Kala,
"When you get to your room, take off your clothes and burn them immediately."
Kala stood still, the weight of the driver's words pressing down on her. Staggering, Calla made her way into the dorm building, her mind still spinning. She fumbled with her key at the door, her hands shaking uncontrollably. Once inside, Calla rushed to her roommate's bed, shaking her awake. Her roommate listened, wide-eyed, as Calla explained what had happened. Without hesitation, Calla frantically began taking off her clothes, her movements hurried and desperate. She gathered them into a pile, staring at them as her mind replayed the driver's warning. With trembling hands, Calla picked up the clothes and went to the bathroom. She struck a match and dropped it onto the pile of fabric. The flames quickly consumed the clothes. But had it really ended? She returned to her room, exhausted, lying down on her bed, but unable to shake off the lingering terror. The room was silent. Only the sound of her and her roommate's breathing filled the space. The next morning, sunlight poured in, as if to dispel the previous night's fear, but unease still clung to her. She stood before the mirror, seeing herself clearly. Her head, her eyes, and her entire body, but her gaze was far from peaceful. She couldn't erase from her mind the image the driver described the moment when he didn't see her head in the mirror. The darkness from the night before still lingered in her thoughts, as if waiting for a moment of weakness to return. She knew her life would never be the same. The haunting memory of being headless and the spirit the driver had tried to divert would forever follow her, reminding her that terrifying things exist right next to us in the most unexpected moments.